Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 34, Mycenaean Greece. The year is 1876, and the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, fresh off his monumental discovery of Troy in western Anatolia, has done it again. This time in the ancient city of Mycenae. The city had already been rediscovered a couple of decades previously, but aside from the restored Great Lion Gate, not much had progressed there. But Schliemann knew that the old texts described the city as rich in gold, and just as he had found treasure at Troy, so too was he convinced that a fortune must be hidden here as well. He was right, of course. Grave circles located a little to the south of the city entrance contained a find that would make Indiana Jones blush with envy. 19 bodies in one grave alone, a small arsenal of bronze swords, daggers, and axes, numerous clay pots painted in magnificent styles, and of course, the now famous artifacts of Agamemnon's mask and Nestor's drinking cup. Not that these really belong to the mythical kings, but it certainly makes things a bit more interesting than gold death mask number 32B, right? From these golden death masks to jewelry, silver cups, and perfectly preserved suits of armor. Such wealth could only have belonged to a legendary king, so no wonder he originally thought that this was the tomb of Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces at Troy. He quickly sent a telegram to King George I of Greece that read, "With great joy I announce to your majesty that I have discovered the tombs, which the tradition proclaimed by Pausanias indicates to be the graves of Agamemnon, Cassandra, Eurymedon, and their companions, all slain at a banquet by Clytemnestra and her lover Aegathos." Thing is, these graves were built around 1600 BC, making them far older than the estimated date of Agamemnon's life, if he was a real person, by almost 400 years. So really then, how could these people live such luxurious lives that they could just simply bury all this treasure? They must have had so much that they could afford to do this, but it's not like their own land is particularly rich. Where's it all coming from? I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's try to figure out who the Mycenaeans were first before we figure out how they got so rich. Okay, so who are they? These are the descendants of the first Greek-speaking Indo-Europeans to arrive in the mainland. We say Mycenaeans because Mycenae was one of their greatest cities, if not the greatest, but there were many others. Tyrenes, Athens, Thebes, Pylos, and Sparta all have their roots in the Mycenaean world. There are no first-hand accounts of what they called themselves, although the poet Homer records that they used the term Achaeans. This might actually have some weight to it, and I'll bring it up again later in the episode. Much like the Minoans on Crete, a unified history of the Mycenaeans is tough to compose, as they left no recorded story. But we do have one advantage in discussing them, and it's all thanks to the British architect and amateur cryptologist Michael Ventris. It all goes back to when Sir Arthur Evans uncovered Knossos and noticed that the tablets he found contained two types of a pictographic written script, and one looked more sophisticated than the other. Because the writing was done in lines from left to right, he simply called this script linear, and further divided it between A, representing the first script he found, and B, the second more elaborate one. I say elaborate because while linear A has far more symbols than linear B, its designs are fairly basic by comparison. No progress had been made in the decipherment of both scripts, widely believed to be the unknown Minoan language, and it was also assumed that the symbols were letters of their alphabet, or stood for whole ideas. But for Ventris, he went on the hypothesis that the symbols actually stood for syllables, as was proposed by previous researchers Alice Kober and Emmett L. Bennett. Comparing the symbols found from a massive haul of 600 linear B tablets in the ruins of Pylos, he was able to see similarities in some of the words and accurately guessed that they might be city names. Once he had a few syllables down, he worked feverishly to translate the rest. Konoso became Knossos, Pulo became Pylos, and then other words like tirepode, tripodes, or tripod. Ventris had broken the code and revealed that Linear B, while being based off the Minoan writing system, proved the Mycenaeans spoke Greek. The letdown here is that what's written on the tablets isn't terribly riveting stuff. It's mostly bookkeeping, records, receipts, transactions, and the like. One tablet reads, Kokkalos repaid the following quantity of olive oil to Eumedes, 648 liters of oil. And another reads like a court testimonial. Eraitha, the priestess, has and swears she has a special land grant for the god, but the community says that she has 3.9 land measures and a land grant of communal lands. This is still really neat, but it'd be much cooler to read some real history-shaking stuff, like something proving Jason and the Argonauts existed, or Hercules, or Theseus. I don't know, that would be amazing. But developing a writing system seemingly just to handle transactions indicates the Mycenaeans liked doing business, and judging from the sheer amount of tablets found, that business was good. At home, Mycenaean society was palace-based, similar to the Minoans, except for a few key differences. The Mycenaean palace was typically built on a hill, and the main structure was separate from the town it looked down upon, much more like a medieval castle. And whereas the Minoans liked the central open courtyard motif, the Mycenaeans preferred the Megaron as the heart of their palace. It sounds a bit like a Transformer robot, but the Megaron is sort of like a throne room, ceremonial center, feasting hall all rolled into one. Visitors would be received here, banquets would be served, and the king or chieftain could conduct business, all within a single room. Now, if you recall from the last episode, I mentioned how Minoan cities were built without walls or defensive structures. Well, Mycenaean cities definitely were. In fact, the city of Mycenae had such massive stone walls, built by cutting and stacking enormous boulders without mortar, that later Greek visitors proclaimed it was the work of the Cyclopes, the race of one-eyed giants. Yes, some of them go around eating adventurers, but other Cyclopes worked in the forge of the smith god Hephaestus, crafting weapons and tools for the gods. These mighty walls even featured tunnel access for soldiers to maneuver through, and fortified archer stations for raining death onto invaders. The military fortresses of the Mycenaeans are a stark representation of what was at the core of their society: conquest. Where did all that treasure come from in those graves? Well, alongside the simple life of agriculture and trade, the Mycenaeans were avid raiders. Pirates, really. Undefended coastal villages in the Aegean and Anatolia were like low-hanging fruit to them, just waiting to be picked. And who's gonna stop them? Of the two great empires of the early Bronze Age, the Hittites and the Egyptians, neither had a naval fleet in the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans had free range to go after whomever they wanted to, and the biggest prize of all would be the island of Crete. No one knows where the animosity towards the Minoans stemmed from exactly. Maybe it's true that the son of Minos was slain by Athenians and they resented the sacrifices he took. Or maybe it's because, quite simply, the Minoans were their only competitor, having long-standing trading agreements with Egypt, Cyprus, and beyond. But sometime after the Thera explosion, the Minoans lost their influence on the region, and the Mycenaeans seized the opportunity to strike. In 1450, the palaces of Crete burned, although Knossos was spared much of the early destruction, possibly because it was used as an administrative base, overseeing a new Greek colony on Crete. But something must have soured this relationship, as evidence shows that Knossos shared the fate of its sister cities and was sacked and burned in 1375. Without a rival in the Mediterranean, Mycenaean influence and trade spread far and wide. No doubt piracy continued, but with expanded markets in Sicily and Syria, there was probably more of a shift to legitimate trade. Of course, the big players in the region, Egypt and the Hittites, didn't seem to care that Crete was under new masters, provided trade continued unabated. But as to their actual correspondence with the Mycenaeans, we have certain evidence from the Hittites at least that offers up tantalizing evidence. Most alluring of all is the so-called Tawagalwa letter, written in 1250 BC by the Hittite king Hattusili III to an unknown king of the Ahiyawa. That name, Ahiyawa, sounds awfully close to the Greek word Achaioi, which we know better as Achaeans, the Homeric term for the Mycenaeans. Interesting. Reading on, the letter is a request to an Achaean king to convince his brother Tawagalwa to release a Hittite fugitive from a city under Achaean protection. That city is named Milawanda, the Ionian city of Miletus. The Hittite king won't enter the city without the Achaean king's permission, seems fair, and appeals to him to contact his brother. Now the fun part about this letter is that he tells the Achaean king what words to write to his brother. Take a memo. Write to him this: "May you not be hostile against his land. The king of Hatti has persuaded me about the matter of the land of Volusia, concerning which he and I were hostile to one another. And we made peace. Now hostility is not appropriate between us." And there's the big zinger in this letter. It all concerns that word, Volusia, which has been identified as the Hittite word for what the Greeks used to call Wilios, then later Ilios, the Romans Ilium, and the rest of us Troy. For much of modern history, Troy was a lost cause. People had a general idea of where the city might have once been, but no one really suspected it would ever be found. Schliemann changed all that by following the clues mentioned in the Iliad, Homer's account of the Trojan War. By following its directions, namely that the city is near a high mound, that plains surrounded it, that there's a shore nearby, he found an area that fit the bill. Troy would be uncovered on a hill near the Turkish village of Hisarlik, although when it was first uncovered there was an initial sense of disappointment at its lack of grandeur. Schliemann writes, "I am extremely disappointed at being obliged to give so small a plan of Troy. Nay, I had wished to be able to make it 1,000 times larger. But I value truth above everything, and I rejoice that my 3 years' excavations have laid open the Homeric Troy, even though on a diminished scale, and that I approve the Iliad to be based upon real facts." Good to know he realized size isn't everything. And while Troy might not have been the massive city he imagined, it did contain treasure and artifacts, and the revelation that there was not just one city built here, but 9 in total, all building right on top of the same spot. Every time something happened to the previous city, people just kept on building, right into the Roman era. This might seem a bit stubborn, but Troy is in a fantastic location. Good flat farmland, pleasant weather, easy access to the water, and a stranglehold on all trade through the Dardanelles to the Black Sea. The taxes from controlling this location alone made it all the more worthwhile to keep building. Now, the archaeology of all the levels is fascinating, of course, but the one we're going to focus on is Troy 7, the estimated city of the eponymous war. Troy 7 was built around 1300 BC, after an earthquake did a number on the previous settlement, but sometime around 1200 it was destroyed and burned down, this time by invaders. Skeletons with skull fractures have been found amidst the debris, suggesting there was no time to bury them, as well as the signs of war. An arrowhead of early Greek design, along with sling bullets. Now, could all this just be circumstantial evidence? Well, sure, of course, but so much of the 7th layer was destroyed by fire that it makes you wonder what the Trojans were doing that they couldn't put it out. Perhaps losing a war? Maybe. Now, as much as I love my storytelling podcast, I'm not actually going to go over the entire tale of the Trojan War. I know, but for those of you who've never read the Iliad or just need a refresher, here's a quick podcast history of our world sum-up. Atreus, son of the cursed Pelops, had 2 sons of his own, Agamemnon and Menelaus. Agamemnon was now High King of Mycenae, while Menelaus became King of Sparta after marrying the beautiful princess Helen. A diplomatic mission from Troy, led by the Trojan prince Paris, arrived at Sparta to negotiate better trading relations, but the young prince is smitten with Helen's beauty and seduces her, escaping back to Troy in the middle of the night. When Menelaus discovers this, he appeals to his brother to attack Troy and bring back his wife. Agamemnon agrees, convinces most of the independent Greek cities to join the cause, set sail for Troy, and after 10 years of siege, they sneak into the city within a giant wooden horse. Paris is killed, Helen is rescued, and they all live happily ever after, but not really. Obviously, that's a gross simplification of it all, but that's the general idea. And while the real story itself is so fantastic, what I'm more interested in right now is the aftermath of this event. We've got the evidence to suggest a war did happen in Troy, but all the other details have to come to us through legend. For starters, what became of the 2 brothers? For Menelaus, his story is best fleshed out with the inclusion of the Egyptian account of the Trojan War. According to their priests, after Paris left Sparta with Helen, he made a pit stop at Sidon and sacked the city. On his way back to Troy, however, his ship was blown off course and he ended up in Egypt, where the pharaoh had learned of his treachery in Sparta. He ordered Helen and the treasure seized and sent Paris packing back home. By the way, this could also explain why the Greeks waited outside the walls of Troy for 9 years. Helen wasn't home and they didn't think to just ask the Trojans. Anyway, Menelaus finds out she's in Egypt, picks her up there, nearly causes a diplomatic disaster by sacrificing an Egyptian child for good sailing winds, but does return home safe and sound with his bride. Agamemnon, however, would feel the full effect of his family's curse. His wife Clytemnestra loathed him for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia so that the winds would improve, and when he got back home, she and her lover murdered him. They in turn were murdered by his eldest son Orestes, who was then driven mad by the Furies, winged female spirits who punished those committing grievous sins, like matricide. As for the other Greek kings who fought in the war, some would make it back home safely, while others would get royally screwed over like Odysseus, and some would be buried on the shores of Troy. Oh, and a certain Trojan prince from the land of Dardania would escape to start a new life for himself with the Latins of Italy. But that's for another episode. And yet, following the victory at Troy, something happened on the mainland. The already impressive walls of the Mycenaeans were being expanded, bigger and longer, and trade within the region is starting to dry up. And despite the addition of these defenses, over the next 100 years, ending roughly around 1100 BC, Mycenaean society will have totally disintegrated as their palaces went up in flames. And no one's quite sure why. The most traditional theory held by historians concerns the invasion of those descendants of Heracles I mentioned last time, the Dorians. These are tribal Greek speakers coming from the north, and they found the land of Mycenaean Greece weak and fractured. Possibly because if we are to believe the accounts of the Trojan War, then the resources used during this protracted 10-year campaign would have drained the city-states of food, funding, and manpower. Perhaps the Dorians saw this as the opportunity they had been waiting for and pushed south towards the Peloponnese, taking what they believed was theirs by birthright. One by one the old cities fell, Mycenae, Pylos, Sparta, but not Athens due to the self-sacrifice of their king, a fact that Athenians would boast about in later times. To escape the invaders, many Mycenaean Greeks fled and set up colonies in Cyprus, southwestern Anatolia, and the Ionian coast. Others turned to raiding and piracy in Egypt and the Levant, the origins of the Philistines and the so-called Sea Peoples. The Dorian invasion also coincides with the Bronze Age collapse, mentioned way back in episode 14, I believe, as the other areas of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt and Hatti, suffered during this time of societal disarray. Yet when the dust settled, the Dorians were still in Greece, having done away with the systems and methods of the civilized Mycenaeans and Minoans, and instead pursuing the simple life of agriculture. But with that regression also came the loss of the most precious gift the ancient world can give us, writing. We have the clay tablets of the Mycenaeans, ironically, because when their palaces burned up, it baked the clay, hardening it and preserving it through time. But the Dorians were tribal folk who had no need for such things. Without any written information of their activities in history, one could say we're in the dark about them, and how very right you'd be. When we pick up next time, we'll explore what is commonly called the Dark Ages of Greece, so named because of the lack of sources from this time. But that's not to say we're entirely without information, or for that matter Dark Ages implies some kind of grim, stagnant time. Government is re-establishing itself in a new way, and Greek communities all over the region are forging new identities. Not to forget, of course, that at the end of every Dark Age comes a renaissance of sorts. Art and culture will eventually return, and by the mid-700s, a blind poet will preserve through memory and oral tradition the heroes of Troy. It's a time of transition for the Greeks, and for us, on the podcast history of our world. Ancient Greek music can be a bit jarring to the modern ear, but Gregorio Paniagua and his musicians stay true to the sounds of the past. To find out more about where to purchase their album, visit harmoniamundi.com or my website at podcasthistoryofourworld.com.